Going to start second lecture on the same topic, reservation jurisprudential aspect. I invite Dr. Santvana Kumar, assistant professor, to deliver her lecture on the subject.
Good evening, everyone. Before I start, I would actually like to give a bit of a background of myself and the work that I do and the work that I'm trying to do and hopefully contribute to the discussions we're having today and also in the future for transformation of the legal system. I think that is our end goal with regard to caste. So I am Santvana and I've just finished my PhD from JNU. And before that, I've been researching on caste, gender and violence, specifically with regard to Dalit women. So I've spent about 7 to 10 years understanding caste, how it intersects with gender, how violence and the SCST Act, the laws, not just the Act, but jurisprudence in general. So being from JNU, they do not allow you to escape from theory. So that is who I am, and I've done a lot of jurisprudential work. That is why the topic of this lecture. I've been working on these issues for 10 years, and before that, the roots of it started with my experiences actually much younger. Being my father's daughter, I got instilled with these ideas at a very, very young age. But moving on, I think it got more rooted when I started studying law. I think a lot of us have a very personal relationship with the law. So that was also my motivation to study law, and I studied law, and caste was always, that's what they call it, a lived experience, that your experiences talk about how caste works in society and how you want to, how you understand violence and reservation and all these issues. So we call that lived experience. So my lived experience started there, and then I went into studying human rights laws with a specialization. I did an LLM from National Law University, and then I realized that when I first got my topic for violence against Dalit women and a human rights praxis. So I started working on that, and my passion sort of generated with regard to human rights, caste and gender, and that led me back to JNU, where I did my PhD from the Center for Women's Studies and worked specifically on Dalit women, but a lot on the jurisprudential question of caste. So for about 2 years myself, and again my father was in a big part of this journey. For 2 years we've sat, we've discussed, the political, the theory, the lived experience, all of that of caste over the years. So continuing from the discussion of the judgment, I actually want to go a bit back. Why? Because my whole goal in terms of how and all the discussions we're having today are always rooted in actually understanding caste and how we always ignore or how Ambedkar is ignored. So also bringing that back to the law, the judgment, all of that. So I will always say, and I request that the judgment is the larger sort of discussion document we are dealing with today, but I want to expand the ideas that we're going to be looking into, and I'm going to be throwing out ideas here which I hope you all can, all the respected dignitaries can sort of guide me further to develop these ideas in the coming future. So I want to basically start with the idea that I want to start with the idea of Ambedkarite thought. There are 3 things that I will largely be dealing with from the jurisprudential aspect. One that I'm putting out there is Ambedkarite thought, Ambedkarite jurisprudence. Firstly, it does not exist in Indian legal thought. As a theory, as a framework, as a structure, there is no Ambedkarite jurisprudence. And actually, the father of jurisprudence in India is Ambedkar. So we have to start looking at it from that perspective, right? Second, for me, is critical legal studies. Again, Ambedkar was very much influenced by these ideas, though this is a movement that developed in the 1970s in the United States of America. But I'll just take but but its roots actually lie, and we can trace its history back to Ambedkar's connection with US, with race, his time in Columbia University, and critical legal studies thereby is a very big tool for us as lawyers, as legal thinkers, to embrace, to think about, and then to implement in the framework. So, in the discussions, even in judgments, if we see today Chandrachud, Justice Chandrachud brings in a lot of these ideas into his judgments. We've been talking about the language of the judge. And when we look at these languages, we have to see that jurisprudence is not isolated from legal language. Jurisprudence precisely has to be incorporated into the legal language. So these are the ideas that I'm sort of looking at. And so critical legal studies was a movement in 1970s in the US which brought the idea, and it was called radical at that time, but I mean, I don't think it's extremely radical today to question this, but I would like a feedback on this, is that the critical legal studies was the first movement that ever criticized realism. What we call realism and what we understand by realism is that law is taken for its language, what it is, in the technicality of its language, right? When it's taken in the technicality of the language, there is a tendency to read bias into it, because you are not able to read between the lines of the law. And what happens is we end up sticking to the technicality of the language, and that's it. The law is saying this, and that's how we're interpreting it. But in that interpretation, what critical legal studies thinkers did was that they criticized that no judge, no lawyer, no policy maker, no person dealing with the law is free from bias. Bias is inherent within the law itself also, and the law can in itself be the discriminatory aspect. So these are ideas that I feel have not been talked about, and they're very much connected with Ambedkar and Ambedkar's ideas. So these are the ideas I sort of want to put about. Now within critical legal studies, there came out another distinct practice. It started as a theory, and today it is a practice, and today it is also like a tool which is used mostly in now I would say feminist theory, but it started as a race theory for blacks in America, where they questioned the legal system, saying, where do the black women come in, sort of. So they broke down the differences, that there is a difference between the black man, the black woman, the white man, and the white woman. So these, and at the intersection of the caste, class, gender, race, so there is an intersection. You have these roads of caste, class, gender, race. हमारे सारे experiences यहाँ पे आपके इस intersection पे मिलते हैं. So that is what is essentially called intersectionality. And I have been working on this for a while, and I specialize in this, and that's why this word has come up in my introduction a lot. So intersectionality. Now Justice Chandrachud has actually implemented intersectionality in a judgment in 2021, which is the Patanjamwali judgment. It was about a blind Dalit girl's rape, and he brings in intersectionality in its whole theoretical discourse in the judgment. Right? But even then, what I argue and what I will bring in is two things that we have to start looking at. One that we have to look at are ideas of substantive equality. Ambedkar never talked about equality. Ambedkar talked about substantive equality, which means that there is equality beyond just Article 14, but within, to achieve actual equality, you have to meet levels of oppression, experiences, where gender aa jata hai aapka, where women ke experiences are different from the men. So Dalit women's experiences are different from the men, because their vulnerability, the way they are more vulnerable to violence, all of these ideas. So how do you bring in substantive equality? कि आपके experiences impact the way equality is achieved in society. दूसरा is the idea of structural discrimination, which again this judgment misses out on. There is a word that comes up in the judgment constantly, which is homogeneity, homogeneous. And I will come back to this idea of homogeneous and homogeneity and heterogeneity because I spent quite a bit of time. But before I come back to this, I want to come back to Ambedkar. And one of the debates and discourses and a lot of scholars and sociologists, political scientists over the years, national and international, have this confusion. I myself had it for about 1 year when I was writing my PhD. When, and I think Sir has brought it up in his lecture as well, where does the point of untouchability begin? What is actually caste and what is caste-based hierarchy? So Ambedkar calls it graded hierarchy, right? What we understand it by graded hierarchy is within that structure of graded hierarchy are hierarchies within itself. That is one thing Ambedkar uniquely says about caste. Second, he says why caste is different from any other system of discrimination is of endogamy and exogamy, which is basically intercaste marriages, which is basically purity and pollution. The core of the caste system is lying in purity and pollution, the mixture of blood. Actually, the core of it, and that's what he's saying. So there are two schools of thought when caste is discussed. One is the post-colonial that Sir is actually talking about, which the judgment picks up. It takes caste as a given category कि untouchability है और ये caste है और इनके साथ ये untouchable practices है. But caste is not that simple. Caste is very complex, and caste is rooted in the idea that we ignore what Ambedkar says. Graded hierarchy, endogamy, exogamy, purity and pollution. And lastly, he says that caste is a state of mind. It's psychological. It is a disease in our society. Now, these are all also jurisprudential aspects. But what we do is, we do not and are unable to bring it into the legal philosophy, thereby transforming the laws, asking for amendment in the laws. That is what I am arguing for, even in the judgment. So, moving on, these are the two schools of thought. That Ambedkar believes that Indology में है roots casteism. वो हमेशा से उनके लिए casteism will lie in the scriptures. That is called the school of Indology. And for the other scholars, the post-colonial scholars, and these scholars are the upper caste men or white colonial men who said that caste started as a form of untouchability when the Britishers came in. And the Britishers came in and they said, okay, we have to understand India. So they picked up the Brahmins, the Qazis, all of that, because Mughal Empire को उस वक्त खत्म करना था. So they brought it and they said, ये India का system है, ये हम documentation बना रहे हैं. Thereby caste became a system that the British understood. उसके अलावा और भी बहुत theories हैं of caste. The Portuguese, I think you will be able to give a better breakdown of that. So all these ideas of caste, firstly, are important for us also to understand. How are we looking at caste? How are we understanding caste? And till date, just recently, an Oxford handbook on caste came out by S.S. Jodha. Its inauguration took place at IHC India Habitat Center. All big scholars of caste were there, and they all said one thing. They said the origin of caste is known to no one, ha 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 ha. And there were only a few Ambedkarite people who said, no, we know, ask us. But nobody is asking because Ambedkar को अभी तक किसी ने actually पढ़ा नहीं है, inclusive of me who's spending her time, a lot of her life and devoting her life to it. So these are the things that I feel we need to be looking at, and firstly, so I'm arguing for Ambedkar's writing as jurisprudential thought. अगर हमें transformation लाना है, अगर हमें कोई भी judgment को critique करना है, the roots of its answers actually lie with Ambedkar, and firstly reading and writing Ambedkar legally, understanding his writings legally in the framework of human rights, in the framework of critical legal theory. Once we do that, once we utilize such languages, do we have a scope in the legal system to question the legal system. Again, my roots, I'm not a technically practicing lawyer or a judge for that matter. So like I said, I wanted to make sure that my ideas are rooted in jurisprudence. Second that I want to bring in is critical legal studies, जिसका introduction मैंने आपको दिया, तो उसी में ही critical race theory है. Now Kimberly Crenshaw, this is a 1989, so this is a 1989 movement. India को ये more than 30-40 years लगे, came out in 2021, जहाँ पे अब हमारा एक precedent है, जहाँ पे जब हम violence against Dalit women की बात करते हैं, we can say that the Dalit woman is different and she is more vulnerable to violence, to rape, to sexual violence or discrimination for that matter, because she is a woman and because she is a Dalit woman. अब तक हम सिर्फ ये judgments में नहीं देख पा रहे थे. I have spent a lot of my time reading these judgments. I have created an archive about 40 to 50. So from Bhavri Devi to the recent Patanjam Wali judgment, I have tried to go through them. And one thing for sure is कि कास्ट और जेंडर के इंटरसेक्शन को कोई लेजिस्लेटर ना जज समझ पाए. देखिए वल्नरेबिलिटी कहाँ से आती है और आप उसको लॉ में कैसे प्रूव करोगे. सो वी हैव इंटरसेक्शनैलिटी एज अ प्रेसिडेंट, thereby we have a precedent which is saying कि critical legal studies को भी हम एक रास्ता बना सकते हैं to talk about the transformation of the law. Lastly, what I want to sort of bring into discussion also are ideas of structural violence. So what the judgment also misses out. So when we talk about homogeneous and heterogeneous, and I will come to that. But before I want to sort of introduce structural violence, structural discrimination, which thereby results in substantive equality. And this is something Ambedkar also talks about in his writings. So he talks about social endosmosis, right? And he talks, what he means by social endosmosis is that when we look at transformation in society, it has to be a trickle-down effect. That trickle-down effect, कि equality ऐसे नीचे layer by layer pass on होनी चाहिए. How do we achieve that? But that he wrote, and I ended up relating it in my own work to structural discrimination. There is not only discrimination and there is not only violence. There is something called structural violence and there is something called structural discrimination. Because let's say reservations exist, because of that education came in, classes evolved with regard to untouchability, with regard to caste-based practices, people got access to institutions. इस वजह से आज सुप्रीम कोर्ट ये बोल पा रहा है कि हेट्रोजेनिटी है और इस वजह से शेड्यूल कास्ट आर नॉट अ होमोजेनस क्लास एंड वी कैन सब कैटेगराइज देम. Once we can sub categorize them, but what they're forgetting in saying this is that they do not understand what structural discrimination or structural violence. Now what I mean by structural discrimination or structural violence is the fact that there is not always direct forms of violence or discrimination. What would direct discrimination be? मैं आपके हाथ से पानी नहीं पीऊंगी या पीऊंगी. Or direct violence would be the cases of any Dalit woman in any village from Bhavri Devi to Phulan Devi is a direct form of violence. But structural, the word structural by meaning is trying to say that it is indirect, it is subtle, it is discrete. So violence can also be psychological. Discrimination can also have a psychological impact. This is a theory that has come up in 1970s by actually an international, he was a Swedish theorist, he was a political scientist, and he said that even when there is poverty in society, that is structural violence by the state. So the government, आपके ऊपर government भी violence inflict करती है और वो structural violence है. जब poverty होती है, जब आपके taxes नहीं बढ़े जाते, जब आपकी roads नहीं बनी हुई. So similarly, casteism तो is the biggest form of structural violence. Direct तो है ही. But even if we have reservation, even if we have achieved equality, even if we achieve substantive equality for that matter, what is happening is that structural violence, indirect forms of violence get inflicted. And we are all victims of that. How are we going to bring that in the law? The SC/ST Act a lot of the times touches upon it, a lot of the times, the intricacies of it. But how do we make the courts interpret is my question. How do I go and say that not one would be कि मेरा इस institution में reservation की वजह से admission नहीं हुआ, ठीक है, या job नहीं लगी, ठीक है, that is a form of somewhere direct violence, direct discrimination. But when that student goes to class and feels like an outsider, even being a second generation educated Dalit, right? Or when that Dalit girl has also experiences that I'm a girl, I'm not the same as my brother or my cousins or any other male in my family, then she is also a victim of structural violence within her home, right? She might not be a victim of direct forms of violence, but she will be a victim of structural violence. And similarly, that student will be a victim of structural caste-based violence. Because जब वो अपनी यूनिवर्सिटी में जा रहा है, जब एक प्रोफेसर, because he is not that well spoken in English, because for whatever reason वो उसकी क्लास नहीं मैच कर रही, और एक प्रोफेसर उससे ज्यादा किसी और बच्चे को अटेंशन दे रहा है, या as simple as कि a Brahmin boy will never feel the shame of going up to a professor and saying his surname and saying कि मेरे को ये फेलोशिप दे दो या मेरे को कुछ दे दो, मेरे को नोट्स दे दो. No, उनको कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं होती. But why would a Dalit boy? They have that apprehension. As simple as that misapprehension is a result of structural violence. Now these complex ideas. My question, and I think the last question that I'll leave you with. That this is my question. How do we implement these ideas, these thoughts into the law? How do we utilize the law? Because we say that social transformation, इसीलिए that is the tool that Ambedkar picked up, that is the tool we've continued to, and that is the reason why we have gathered today. So my question is that when the court is saying कि homogeneous है, heterogeneity आ गई है, definitely आ गई, there is no question about it. That is why this debate is happening. There is no question about it. This is my own problem in my own research. I cannot be right because what as a Dalit feminist theory is doing, Dalit feminists today are claiming upper caste women cannot write our stories, right? Upper caste people should not be writing about caste. Dalit should be writing about caste. Ambedkar को तो आपने पढ़ा नहीं, अब हमें पढ़ लो, is what is being said. Similarly, Dalit women are saying, हम ब्राह्मण women को नहीं पढ़ेंगे, हमारी कहानी लिखते रहे. In academics, this is what is happening. So we're saying, हमारा काम पढ़ो. But in that, when I started writing my PhD, I said everybody is asking me to write about these women who are experiencing violence. जिनके आप रेप केसेस पे करो, आप ह्यूमन राइट्स पे करो. मैं गई, मैंने सोचा चलो I'll go to the villages, I'll go to Saharanpur, I'll look around. I went around and I said, okay, यहाँ तो caste is functioning in a very different way. They are politically aware, they know of their rights, they know अम्बेडकर ने हमें संविधान दिया है, तो हम लड़ेंगे. जब ये बातें चल रही हैं, तो मैं कैसे वो रिपोर्ट्स में डाल दूं कि जो तो डेटा है, वो डेटा मैंने पढ़ लिया, बट रियलिटी तो कहीं ना कहीं कुछ और है ना. How can I write this story? I can't write this story. I can't write just atrocity is this. Atrocity is more complicated. Atrocity is not even violence, and atrocity is not discrimination. Atrocity is a unique form of structural violence, discrimination, all of these combined that is a result of caste. How are we implementing? So, when we see heterogeneity is not only class के कोई reservation लेके वहाँ पहुँच गया. Heterogeneity आपको villages में भी मिलेगी. Italian scholars इस पे आके यूपी में काम करके जा चुके हैं कि वहाँ के चमार, मणिपुर के चमार्स हैं, उन्होंने वहाँ पे सिलाई बुनाई का काम किया जो ट्रेडिशनली मुस्लिम्स करते थे. So they also transferred into that to move out of untouchable practices. Then they took up the tool of education. This is all in her work. वो 10 साल बिताई उस गांव में रही और उसने समझी है वो बात. And वो करके she went in and she said the chamars have evolved. अब हम इस आर्ग्यूमेंट को कैसे बनाएं कि भाई वायलेंस है, डिस्क्रिमिनेशन है. सेम क्वेश्चन इज माइंड. सिमिलरली आप लैंड ओनरशिप के क्वेश्चन को उठाओ, तो एक्सेस टू एजुकेशन तो रिजर्वेशन लाया है ना, एक्सेस टू लैंड भी लाया है, उससे सोशल ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन भी हुआ है. बट उससे क्या कास्ट की डेवलप, कास्ट क्या कास्टिज्म गया है? नहीं गया। क्या डिस्क्रिमिनेशन गया है? नहीं गया है। क्या वायलेंस गया है? नहीं गया है। क्या लॉ अमेंडमेंट्स आए हैं ढंग से? नहीं आए। सो द क्वेश्चन इज, हाउ आर वी अंडरस्टैंडिंग हेटेरोजेनिटी? व्हाट आर दी सबकास्ट्स? और उन सबकास्ट के एक्सपीरियंसेस को आप कैसे, वो जो आप क्रीमी लेयर की बात कर रहे हो, can you deny that creamy layer is 3-4 generations, still 4 generations behind than that 8th generation educated Brahmin in that institution or at your workplace? No. This is why subcategory का ये argument fail हो जाता है and it's flawed. And that is how you bring in questions of violence and you bring in questions of structural violence and you bring in Ambedkar as a tool for jurisprudential thought, and that is where I sort of end my talk today. Thank you very much.